The story of her downfall began in the most ordinary way. Through a glowing screen, late at night in her small bedroom. 19 years old, restless, and constantly scrolling through social media, she found herself caught in the endless cycle of posts showing luxury, fame, and freedom. She followed accounts of women who traveled to exotic destinations, sipping cocktails by infinity pools, wearing designer dresses, and living lives that felt so far away from hers. In her own world, things were simple, almost painfully so. Her family wasn't poor, but there was nothing glamorous about her life. She went to college, worked part-time at a clothing store, and came home to her quiet suburban street, where every house looked the same. For someone her age, it felt suffocating, like she was missing out on something much bigger. That was when he appeared. His profile looked like something out of a dream. 27 years old, handsome in a polished way, always posing with expensive cars or dining in expensive restaurants. He wasn't just showing off. He spoke with the kind of confidence that made her believe he was someone important. At first it was harmless messages, compliments about her pictures, little jokes that made her feel special. He seemed different from the boys her age, more serious, more put together. Slowly their conversations became longer. He told her about his life in Dubai, how he worked in business, and had connections that gave him access to a lifestyle most people only saw on television. He made her feel like he saw something unique in her, something worth investing in. Weeks turned into months, and what started as casual chats grew into daily communication. He asked about her dreams, her frustrations, her secret wishes. She confessed how she longed to travel, to break out of her routine, to feel like she was living instead of waiting for life to begin. He promised he could give her that. He told her she deserved more than her small town, more than her repetitive life. Every word he typed into her inbox seemed to reach straight into her insecurities and twist them into hope. When he suggested she visit him in Dubai, it felt like an opportunity too good to refuse. At first she hesitated. She had never traveled alone before, let alone to another country. But he reassured her again and again. He sent proof of his wealth, his business ventures, even copies of flight bookings to show he was serious. He offered to cover every expense, promising she wouldn't have to worry about a thing. The idea of stepping into that world felt intoxicating. She told herself it was only a vacation, just a short trip, nothing dangerous. It wasn't like she hadn't heard stories about online relationships gone wrong, but in her mind, those things happened to other people, not to someone who had been so carefully chosen, so attentively pursued. The excitement grew as the day approached. She bought new clothes, styled her hair differently, and even told her friends bits and pieces about the man she was going to meet. She didn't tell her parents the truth. Instead, she made up a story about a college trip, knowing they would never approve. It wasn't that she wanted to deceive them, but she couldn't stand the thought of them holding her back from something that could change her life forever. When the ticket arrived in her inbox, she stared at it for hours. It was real. Her name, the dates, the destination, all there. She printed it and held it in her hands like a golden key to another world. The airport was overwhelming, filled with people moving in every direction, but she felt electrified, as if her real life was only just beginning. Boarding the plane, she gazed out the window as the city she had always known shrank beneath her. She imagined the desert sands, the shimmering skyline, the warm air waiting to embrace her. To her, it wasn't just a flight to another country, it was an escape, a transformation. She had no idea she was stepping into the first trap, one that had been carefully set for months. Every compliment, every promise, every photo he shared had been a piece of bait leading her closer. By the time the plane touched down in Dubai, the lights of the city stretching across the horizon like scattered diamonds, she was completely swept away by the fantasy. She walked off the plane believing she was entering a fairy tale, blind to the reality that awaited. What she thought would be the beginning of her dream was, in truth, the opening scene of her nightmare. The airport greeted her with a rush of warm air that felt different from anything she had ever known. The city stretched tall and proud, glass towers glowing like beacons of wealth and power. For a 19-year-old girl who had only known quiet streets and small shops, it was like stepping into a dream. Waiting for her near the arrivals gate was the man she had trusted through a screen for months. He looked exactly like his pictures, well-dressed, confident, smiling in a way that made her feel like she belonged to this world already. He greeted her with ease, as though they had known each other for years, and led her toward a sleek black car that seemed to glide across the road as it carried them into the heart of Dubai. Her first impression was overwhelming. The lights never seemed to end. The city was alive, loud, and glamorous, with luxury cars passing by in every direction, and strangers dressed in brands she had only ever seen in magazines. He pointed out landmarks as they drove, speaking about the city as though it was his personal playground. She sat in silence, absorbing every detail, her nerves replaced by a kind of awe. It felt unreal, like she had been transported into someone else's life. At the hotel, her breath caught. The lobby gleamed with marble floors, crystal chandeliers, and staff members who treated him with quiet respect. They carried her luggage without question, and she was guided into a suite on one of the top floors. The room was larger than her entire apartment back home, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the glittering cityscape. On the bed were shopping bags filled with clothes and accessories, each tag displaying numbers that made her dizzy. He told her they were hers now, gifts to welcome her. The gesture stunned her, and though part of her felt nervous, another part convinced herself that this was what trust looked like: generosity, attention, effort. The days that followed unfolded like a carefully crafted fantasy. He took her to the most exclusive restaurants, where plates of food looked more like artwork than meals. They strolled through malls so large they felt like cities on their own. She tried on dresses worth more than what her family earned in a month, and he encouraged her to take them without hesitation. He told her she looked like she belonged in this world. For the first time in her life she believed it. But behind the shimmering facade, there were moments that unsettled her. Phone calls that seemed too secretive, hushed conversations in languages she couldn't understand, and messages that appeared on his phone at odd hours. Sometimes, when he left the room to take these calls, his entire demeanor shifted from charming to cold, his voice sharp and businesslike. She asked him once about it, and he brushed it off, telling her he had responsibilities and deals to manage. She accepted the answer, but unease settled quietly in the back of her mind. Then came the drinks. Every outing included cocktails, champagne, or glasses of something strong. He insisted she try them all, smiling as if it were part of the experience. At first, she agreed eagerly, seeing it as harmless fun, but soon she noticed something strange. Her body reacted differently than she expected. After just a few sips, her vision blurred, her thoughts slowed, and hours disappeared from her memory. She would wake up in the mornings unsure of what had happened the night before. When she mentioned it to him, he reassured her it was normal, that the drinks were strong and she wasn't used to them. His calm explanation made her doubt her own instincts. As the nights passed, the sense of disorientation grew stronger. She remembered flashes, bright lights, loud music, voices of people she didn't recognize. She thought she saw strangers in the room at times, men in expensive suits laughing, clinking glasses, watching her with unsettling interest. But when she woke up, it was always just him beside her, the suite spotless as though nothing unusual had happened. She began to wonder if her mind was playing tricks on her. Despite the unease, she couldn't bring herself to confront him fully. Everything around her was too perfect, too dazzling. She told herself that this was what living a luxurious life must feel like. Disorienting, overwhelming, larger than anything she had ever known. It was easier to believe in the fantasy than to question it. The clothes, the views, the attention, these things drowned out the quiet alarm ringing inside her. What she did not realize was that the vacation was never about her enjoyment. Every step, from the airport to the gifts, was part of a design, a slow erosion of her defenses. By the time she began to notice the missing pieces in her memory, it was already too late. Her passport was no longer in her bag. Her phone now required a code she hadn't set. The walls of the suite seemed less like the walls of paradise, and more like the bars of a cage. She thought she was living her dream, but the truth was that the dream had been carefully built to disguise the trap. Her days and nights began to blend into a blur that she could no longer separate. At first she thought it was just exhaustion from the whirlwind pace of her new life. The endless shopping trips, the long nights at restaurants and lounges, the constant movement in a city that never seemed to sleep. But then she noticed the strange gaps in her memory. She would wake up in different clothes than the ones she remembered putting on, her body sore in ways she couldn't explain, her mind foggy and slow. The mornings brought confusion, but each time she tried to piece things together, he distracted her with gifts or compliments, turning her doubt into silence. It became easier to push the questions aside than to confront them. Flashes of strange images haunted her. She remembered loud music, the pulsing rhythm of bass shaking her chest, and faces of men she didn't know watching her as if she were part of some performance. She recalled the sting of alcohol on her lips, the sharp smell of cologne surrounding her, and sometimes laughter that didn't sound right, like it was directed at her instead of with her. When she tried to hold on to these fragments, they slipped away, as though her mind itself had been tampered with. She told herself maybe it was the alcohol, maybe she simply couldn't handle it. But deep down she felt there was more to it than that. The illusion of safety started to crack the night she discovered the marks on her arms. Small bruises, faint but undeniable, lined her skin as if she had been held down. She couldn't remember how they got there. When she asked him about them, his answer came too easily, too rehearsed. He told her she had fainted, and someone had helped carry her. He laughed as though it were nothing serious. She wanted to believe him, but the unease in her stomach grew heavier with every passing day. She began noticing how her belongings had changed. Her passport, once tucked safely in her bag, was gone. Her phone no longer felt like her own, many of her apps had disappeared, and some of her messages had been deleted. When she asked him about it, he insisted he had done it for her safety, saying she needed to be careful about scams and hackers in a foreign country. His words were calm and logical, but she felt stripped of her independence. Without documents or her phone, she had nothing to prove who she was or where she belonged. It dawned on her slowly that she was no longer a guest on a vacation but a prisoner, disguised in silk dresses and sparkling jewelry. The more she noticed, the more terrified she became. His suite was always spotless, yet she began to catch small details that didn't make sense. An unfamiliar jacket left on the back of a chair, glasses with lipstick stains that weren't hers, and the faint echo of conversations that stopped the moment she opened a door. Each night blurred into the next, but her body carried the memories her mind couldn't hold. Her energy drained, her appetite disappeared, and her eyes hollowed from the weight of fear she couldn't voice. Once, she tried to fight back. She refused the drink he handed her at a dinner, pushing it away with shaking hands. His expression shifted for the first time, the smile slipping into something colder, sharper. He didn't raise his voice, but the silence that followed was more terrifying than any outburst could have been. That night she woke up in a different room, not the suite she had grown used to. The walls were bare, the bed unfamiliar, and the people around her strangers, who looked at her as if she were an object. She tried to scream, but her voice was weak, her body heavy, and within moments everything faded again. The cycle repeated until she no longer knew how many days had passed. The city outside the window still sparkled with promises of wealth and opportunity, but she had no access to it anymore. Her world had been reduced to hotel rooms, drugged nights, and waking up in confusion. She realized she wasn't the center of his affection. She was part of a business, something being sold and passed around. Her so-called boyfriend was not her protector, but her captor, and everything he had given her was just part of the bait to lure her into this role. By the time she admitted the truth to herself, she felt powerless. She wanted to escape, but her body no longer responded the way she needed it to. She couldn't run, couldn't think clearly, couldn't even trust her own memories. The dream that had once lifted her from her small, quiet life had turned into a nightmare, where every glittering light in Dubai was a reminder of her cage. The world outside continued as if nothing had happened, while she, hidden behind the walls of luxury, was slowly being erased. The walls of the penthouse that once seemed like paradise began to close in on her. The floor-to-ceiling windows with their glittering views of Dubai no longer looked like freedom, but like cruel reminders of everything she could not reach. She had been stripped of her documents, her phone was altered, and her strength was drained night after night by substances slipped into her drinks. It was only when she started piecing together the fragments of her foggy memories that she understood the full depth of her situation. She wasn't just being kept, she was being sold. The evidence revealed itself slowly, like pieces of a puzzle she hadn't realized she was trapped in. On his laptop, which he carelessly left open once, she caught sight of files bearing her name alongside photos she didn't remember being taken. Her own face appeared in images with strangers in suits, men she vaguely recalled seeing in her blurred visions of parties and gatherings. The horror of it sank in as she scrolled further. Lists, numbers, coded messages and payments. She was a commodity, a name on a roster of others, just like her. Girls whose identities were hidden but whose pictures told stories of the same trap she had fallen into. The man she once thought was her savior had turned her into a transaction. She began to notice the rotation of men who entered the suite. They arrived with the quiet confidence of people who knew they wouldn't be questioned. Some came dressed for business, others in casual luxury, but all carried the same cold look in their eyes. She was no longer a guest in the room, but part of its entertainment. Each night, when the drinks and the haze consumed her, she slipped further from herself, and each morning, when she woke up disoriented and sore, the evidence of what had happened clung to her like invisible chains. Once, she tried to run. She slipped out of the suite while he was distracted, barefoot, clutching the hotel keycard like it was her lifeline. She made it as far as the lobby, her heart pounding, her breath sharp and panicked. For a moment, she thought she might actually succeed, but before she could reach the exit, two men intercepted her. They weren't hotel security, but they acted like they belonged there. Their grip was firm, unyielding, as they escorted her back upstairs. She looked around desperately, waiting for someone to notice, someone to question why a terrified girl was being dragged away. But the staff averted their eyes. It was as if they had seen it all before and decided it wasn't their business. The betrayal cut deeper than she expected. After that, her treatment changed. She was no longer handled with the careful illusion of romance and luxury. The mask had slipped, revealing the machinery behind the act. He was colder, sharper, no longer wasting energy, pretending to care. The gifts stopped coming, replaced instead with threats hidden behind calm tones. He reminded her of her dependence, her isolation, the impossibility of escape. The clothes she wore were no longer hers to choose, and the food she ate was whatever was left for her. The fantasy of being special was gone. She was simply another girl in his system, another nameless body in his trade. But what frightened her most wasn't the men or the control. It was him. The man who had once filled her messages with charm and promises now looked at her with nothing but calculation. His eyes were cold, hollow, as if she wasn't even human anymore. She realized that she had never been anything more than a project to him, a piece of bait carefully nurtured until it was ready to be used. Every sweet word, every lavish gift, every gesture of affection had been part of a plan to break her down, to remove her defenses until she was exactly where he wanted her. She began to lose sense of herself. Her reflection in the mirror felt foreign, a hollowed version of the bright girl who had once packed her suitcase with dreams of freedom. Now her skin looked pale, her eyes sunken, her smile gone. The girl who had longed for adventure had been replaced by someone who could barely recognize her own face. She tried to hold on to fragments of her past, memories of her family, her home, the friends she had lied to before leaving. But even those thoughts grew faint, as if he was erasing not just her freedom but her very identity. The nights stretched on endlessly. The city outside the window glittered with lights that promised opportunity, but to her they looked like cruel stars, shining on a world she no longer belonged to. Every sound in the hallway made her flinch. Every knock at the door filled her with dread. She knew she wasn't the first girl to fall into his trap, and she feared she wouldn't be the last. Yet the darkest realization of all was that she was running out of time. She could feel herself fading piece by piece, until she would become just another nameless figure in the files he kept, erased from the world outside, remembered only as a transaction. The final weeks of her captivity felt endless, as if time itself had dissolved into the haze of drugs and fear. She no longer knew the days of the week, no longer kept track of mornings or nights. The suite's heavy curtains stayed drawn most of the time, leaving her with only the artificial glow of lamps that blurred the difference between daylight and darkness. Her world had shrunk to 4 walls, her body, and the unrelenting knowledge that she was being used, night after night, by men who treated her as though she didn't exist beyond the moment. The girl who had once dreamed of freedom and adventure was gone, replaced by a hollow shell moving on command. Then, without warning, the cycle broke. It started with chaos echoing through the hallways of the hotel, doors slamming, hurried footsteps, voices raised in panic. At first she thought it was just another gathering, another night of strangers, but the tone was different this time. Shouts in English and Arabic blended together, the sharp command of unfamiliar voices cutting through the air. When the suite door burst open, she braced for another group of men, but instead she saw uniforms, flashing lights reflecting off their gear, and the unmistakable presence of law enforcement. For a moment, she thought she was hallucinating, her mind creating hope where none existed. They found her slumped on the couch, dazed and weak, her body barely able to move. One officer bent down, speaking words she couldn't fully understand, but his tone was urgent, gentle in a way she hadn't heard in months. Her vision blurred as hands guided her out of the suite, past the chaos of men being restrained, phones and laptops seized, voices yelling in protest. The air outside the suite felt different, almost too clean, too real. For the first time in what felt like forever, she was no longer under his control. The days that followed were a fog of recovery. She was taken to a medical facility, her system detoxed from the drugs that had kept her compliant. Doctors spoke quietly about what they found: substances in her blood, bruises marking her skin, exhaustion that had worn her body down to near collapse. She spent hours in silence, staring at white walls, trying to convince herself she was safe. Each time she closed her eyes, flashes of the nightmare returned. His cold eyes, the stranger's hands, the laughter that had haunted her nights. When investigators interviewed her, she struggled to piece together her story. So much of it was fractured, memories blurred by the drugs, but the fragments she could recall were enough to paint a horrifying picture. The files recovered from his laptop confirmed everything. She was one of many, each girl lured by promises of luxury and freedom, each trapped and sold under the guise of glamour. She had not been chosen because she was special. She had been chosen because she was easy to manipulate, like all the others before her. The man, who had once flooded her messages with affection, was gone before the authorities could arrest him. He vanished into the web of connections that had protected him all along, leaving behind nothing but traces of the empire he had built on broken lives. For weeks, investigators hunted him, piecing together evidence of his crimes, but his escape left her with a chilling realization. While she had been saved, he was still free. Somewhere he was likely setting another trap, sending another girl the same messages, making the same promises, building the same illusion. Her survival became both a blessing and a burden. Reporters called her story shocking, sensational, but she couldn't stand to hear it repeated. Each word reminded her of what she had lost: the trust, the innocence, the part of herself that once believed in fairy tales. She returned home eventually, but nothing felt the same. The streets she had once thought dull now seemed fragile and safe, in a way she hadn't appreciated before. The faces of her family were lined with worry, their joy at her return mixed with grief for the girl she had been before she left. In quiet moments, she tried to rebuild. She attended therapy, forcing herself to speak truths that made her voice shake. She learned to live again without the haze of drugs, to reclaim her reflection in the mirror as her own. Yet, no matter how much time passed, A part of her remained trapped in that suite, in the glittering city where she had been nothing more than a product. Her story spread as a warning. Online, her experience was told and retold, sometimes twisted, sometimes exaggerated, but at its core remained a truth too many ignored. Behind the images of luxury, the promises of wealth, and the glamorous lifestyles showcased on social media, predators waited. They studied, they planned, and they struck. When girls like her reached for the dream of something bigger, what looked like an escape could be the beginning of captivity. She never spoke his name publicly, not because she wanted to protect him, but because she understood the danger of him still being free. Instead, she used her voice to caution others, to tell them that the world was not as it appeared on a glowing screen. The glitter of paradise could hide the darkest traps, and while she had survived, she knew many never did. Her life had changed forever. She no longer dreamed of luxury or escape. Her only dream now was for others to see the warning in her story, to recognize the danger before they boarded a plane to what they thought was freedom. For her, the lights of Dubai would always be a reminder, not of beauty or opportunity, but of how close she had come to disappearing completely.